Caseloads have been lower than forecast, but the pandemic is hitting Africa's economy hard, disrupting tourism and other crucial sectors. With work at a standstill for many, there's less money for food and shelter. Here in the Lavendar Hill section of Capetown, volunteers are ever present to feed the homeless and children. Evictions are on the rise, and lives are becoming more precarious. The pandemic, meanwhile, rages across the African continent. Cases in Algeria and Egypt are on the decline, but they're ticking up in Morocco and Tunisia. What would another wave of COVID-19 mean for a region already so hard hit? 3 million people in South Africa have lost their work because of the pandemic, and as a result, many have lost their homes. DW correspondent Adrian Krish takes us to one of the many shanty towns now popping up across the country.
Caseloads, the largest township in Cape Town. More than 1 million people live here, including Zuleka Velengani. A month ago, she could no longer afford the rent and simply built her own hut on a vacant lot next door. Hundreds of others did the same and christened the new neighborhood COVID-19.
Because everything just happens because of this COVID. There were lost jobs, there were nothing for us, money, anything, man. That's why we have to take that COVID-19 name.
Zuleka shows us the makeshift hut where she lives with her boyfriend and 3 children.
This is my house. I've been staying here. The space is too small. I've got 1 bed, so where are the children are going to sleep? You see, my house is also have leaking spots. I don't have anything to solve at the moment. I don't have money, but I'm still here.
The family pays no rent here, but the land doesn't belong to them.
The people are setting up their shacks all over the place here. A lot of construction happening, and many here are saying they don't have a choice because they can't afford to pay rent any longer. But the city, on the other hand, says these illegal land invasions are causing huge problems.
City officials tell us there have been more than 30 new locations with massive land occupations in just the last 6 weeks. Law and order are in danger. Cape Town lost 300 hectares of land in the last year.
Whatever the land was meant for is lost. Whether it is a hospital, a school, a clinic. If a piece of land is standing open, it's because there is an intended community use for that land. There is, in the case of these big Khayelitsha land invasions, where I will tell you that community leadership in Khayelitsha stood up. This is not a fight against land invaders against the state or land invaders against the city of Cape Town. This is a fight of land invaders against the city of Cape Town and local residents.
Since June, the city says it has torn down some 60,000 huts, in some cases resulting in violence. This man was pulled out of his hut naked. A court has now ruled that the city needs a court order for evictions and must offer alternative accommodation to squatters.
Illegal structures were removed.
But the city can't afford that. 400,000 people are already on waiting lists for social housing.
That housing waiting list doesn't get shorter, and the reason it doesn't get shorter is because there's constantly people pushing in the front. If you were standing in a queue in a bank or at a cinema or theatre or something, and you never got to the front because people were constantly pushing in the front, you would become very angry and enraged.
Zuleka Velengani and her family have also been hoping for an apartment from the state for a long time, so far in vain.
The government should provide us our needs, because we need something like toilets, water, electricity. We have to get them from the government. It's our right, most. If we have to live in this place, we have to. Because when we need to go to the loo or you want to do the number 2, you have to take the bucket and then you dig there. So the place is going to be full of all those things. You can't go to the bush there and sit because there are people who are building their house also.
Zuleka is convinced that she will continue to live here in the future. A court order for eviction takes up to 1.5 years. The police are not intervening for the time being, and around her, the settlement continues to grow.
Now, it's not just shelter that's been thrown into question because of the pandemic. Food is also becoming scarcer in parts of Africa. The central Sahel region is among the continent's hunger hotspots. More than half of the populations of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger suffers from food insecurity. defined as the lack of regular access to the food they need. In Mali, the trend is even getting worse. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by David Beasley, the Executive Director of the World Food Program. He joins me from Berlin. David, it's good to see you as always. When we talk about food insecurity, this term, help us understand what that looks like on the ground for someone in Mali or, say, Burkina Faso.
Well, it's not good at all. I mean, it was already bad before COVID. We had economic deterioration, a lot of serious issues with extremist groups, terrorist groups trying to exploit the situation. And not to mention that, you got climate change moving down and millions of people being displaced, and all of a sudden COVID comes right on top of that. And so globally, we're seeing from, and I'm not talking about people that are going to bed hungry. I'm talking about people that are on the brink of starvation. That number was at 135 million before COVID. Now we see that number spiking to 270 million by the end of this year. And you break that down into places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and other regions of Africa. It really is a bad situation that we're facing, and we're facing it literally as we speak, and it's unfolding as we speak.
David, in what ways is the pandemic itself affecting food supplies? This doesn't really involve sickness necessarily, does it?
Well, it's a combination of factors. I mean, you know, what we're seeing, let me give you a good example. In Nigeria, when they had a 5-week lockdown, they had about 1,000 people die from COVID, but we had 1 million people go into food insecurity because of the lockdown. And so we're seeing economic deterioration. We're seeing a spike in food prices throughout Africa, lack of access, economic deterioration, loss of jobs. You know, if you do a lockdown, and let's say in Berlin, people have got food in their pantry for a week or two. But in a lot of these places, they live hand to mouth, day to day. So if you do a lockdown, you got to make certain that we have a safety net program in place. If you don't, and we don't address this right, you will either have mass starvation, mass destabilization, or mass migration. And it's a lot cheaper to go in and help the people who need help during this extremely difficult time.
Well, what exactly is needed to improve that situation? You talk about going in. What kind of resources do you need, and how close are you to getting it?
Well, you're not talking about a few hundred million, you're talking about billions of dollars around the world, but particularly in Africa. If we get the right money right now, we can come in, because we're actually the supply chain for COVID at this point in time, you know, with the airline industry shutting down. So we're moving in COVID supplies, moving in food, doing what we can do to make certain that we don't have export bans, shut down the distribution points, because if you do, you might not be able to get seeds in or fertilizers or food or whatever the case may be. Now, what is critical is economic recovery. And I know countries like Germany, which has been an amazing partner with us in economic stimulus packages, also helping us direct monies on the ground in these strategic locations, because if we don't come in with strategic support, you're going to have destabilization and migration. People don't want to leave their home area, but if they don't have food and they don't have any degree of peace, they're going to do what it takes to do to protect their family, their children, their little girls and little boys. And I've had more mothers tell me, say, my husband didn't want to join ISIS or Al Qaeda, but we hadn't fed our little girl in 2 weeks. Mr. Beasley, please help us. And so thankfully, the people of Germany, the people around the world are stepping up, but we still have a lot more money we need over the next many months. And this is not going to play out just in the next couple of months. I am really concerned about 2020, but I'm extremely concerned about 2021, because the economic impact that COVID has had is going to play out, I think, in a devastating way with economic opportunity in Africa. And so it's not a short ball game we're talking about. It's a long run, and we've got to be really prepared for it.
All right, an urgent appeal there from David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Program. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now it's time for your questions to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
Does smoking aid the spread of COVID-19?
Smokers have had it pretty tough during this pandemic. As far as I can tell, there's still not absolute watertight evidence of a direct link between smoking regularly and worse outcomes if you catch COVID-19. But I wouldn't wait for that proof. I mean, come on, this is a potentially severe respiratory disease, and we know that smokers are hit harder when they catch a range of other pathogens that cause similar symptoms. But if they have COVID-19, does the act of smoking also make them more contagious to others? Could their secondhand smoke pose a danger of infection to those around them? Well, we don't really know, and it's extremely hard to prove one way or the other, but there's enough evidence it might that some regions in Spain banned smoking in public last month, and other public spaces like some casinos in the US have done the same. The smoke that comes in a cloud out of a smoker's mouth when they exhale forcefully is basically a mix of particulates and aerosols that's exiting from deep within that person's lungs. And the evidence has grown pretty convincing that aerosols can carry the virus. So while there's no conclusive evidence on whether secondhand smoke is more or less infectious than aerosols exhaled by non-smokers, a lot of experts think it makes sense to err on the side of caution. I mean, after all, many are now saying that if you can smell what someone had for lunch, you can also potentially catch COVID-19 from them. So it seems to me that the same would hold true for inhaling someone's secondhand smoke.